You're going to grab yourself another cup of coffee. We're going to roll right on into learning about the Miss Swan Fox. Mrs. Sorry. I should make a generation that forgot about that. And thank you so much to Rick again, and all of our speakers and all of our sponsors too. Please make sure that you visit our friends in the back, especially those that have new books published. Visit Ivan and enjoy yourselves first and foremost. But without further ado, my new friend is Karen MacNutt to discuss Mrs. Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Some of you know I'm a lawyer from Boston. I became interested in General Marion through Walt Disney, like many other folks out there. I've been coming down here for some period of time, giving different talks on different things. And today I'm going to talk about Mary Esther Vido Marion, also known as Mrs. General Marion, or as Carol would call her, Mrs. Swan Fox. Now, not a lot has been written about Mary Esther. There's some stuff on the internet, all of which is absolutely strange and not true. But I thought we would explore today just who this lady was who captured the Swamp Fox. Now, Harry Lee, like course Harry Lee, served with General Marion in 1780, 1781. He was a young man. He had his Lee's Legion, and he did a short biography of Marion in his memoirs. And in it he says that the charms of the fair, like the allurements of wealth, were totally lost on Marion. His whole attention was directed to confounding the enemy and obtaining supplies for his troops. We have to wonder where Harry found out that the charms of the fair were lost on Marion. It kind of raises an interesting story that we know nothing about. There must have been something that was observed that somebody threw himself at the general and he was unimpressed. That women would try to charm him must have been a very new experience for poor Marion, because he was short and not particularly handsome. But as the war came to the end, military figures back there, people who had done heroic things, or powerful people, were like the rock stars of today. And so women, certain types of women, are attracted by famous and powerful men. And certainly, as the war drew to a close in South Carolina, Francis Marion was probably one of the most powerful men in the state. We think of him as being stern and emotionless, but there was another side to him that we don't generally hear about, because most of the people who talk about Marion met him in the middle of the dark days of the war, when there was absolutely nothing to be happy about. But Alexander Garden wrote after the war a little sort of a retrospective of Marion, because he was dead by that time, of General Marion. And Garden wrote, "He was, when necessary, secret as the grave, appeared generally thoughtful, and was approached by his officers with reverent awe. But when out of reach of the enemy, and at liberty to give indulgence to the natural cheerfulness of his disposition, he was familiar with his intimates and the gentlemen of his family." Now they're talking about his military family, his staff. "Even to playfulness. In private life, he was distinguished by the strictest integrity in all his dealings. He was the executor of several estates and the guardian of many children. Every duty was performed to perfection. No man lived more beloved. None ever died more universally and justly lamented." I don't think that Cornwallis would have called Marion cheerful, playful, or would have been impressed by the fact he seemed to like children because he was willing to be the guardian of a number of them. That's not the general picture we have of the general. And yet, this was his other personality. This was the other side of him. There's a problem with being powerful. When you're sitting on the top, somebody always wants to knock you off. And in Marion's case, many of the people who had been powerful before the British seized Charlestown, had left the state, and were in Pennsylvania for the most part for the duration of those horrible, dark years of the war. When the British started to be driven out of the state, these folks started to come back. And they expected to resume their places of importance, and here's Francis Marion sitting at the top of the hill, and they're no longer up at the top of the hill, and so you all know how politics works. Marion started having problems with people kind of trying to push him out of the way, should we say. The other thing, as we were told by Mr. Ganey, that is that Marion took the position of reconciliation with the Loyalists. And this was not a popular position. South Carolina easily could have descended into a reign of terror, just like they had in France at the end of the French Revolution. So that when Christopher Gadsden took the position of reconciliation, he started getting death threats. He warned Marion about people who would literally be out to get him because he wanted to be reconciled with the Tories. But Marion was a principled man and he would not back down. But this was not a happy time for him in particular. He had been in the public service for about 10 years now, playing with the revolution in one sort or another. And he wrote to a friend saying that he was sick to death of public life. And another friend, he said, I feel like an old almanac, useful at one time, but much out of date. And this brings us to 1784. A lot of dirty tricks, I'm not going to go into them, but a lot of dirty tricks have been played on Marion right at the end of the war by the political hangers-on. But in 1784, where the war's been over for about a year, the country is still very much unsettled. And at this point, I will read from William Dawkins James. And he writes, at this juncture, his merits and high reputation had made a favorable impression on the heart of Miss Mary Bideau, one of his relations. She was observed to be fond of hearing his achievements spoken of in high terms of approbation. Some of the general's friends noticed it and gave him a hint. He paid his addresses to her and was well received. They were soon after married. She brought him a handsome fortune, and as there was no great disparity either in their years or disposition, she made him an excellent wife. She was in countenance the exact counterpart of the general. She partook of all his amusements. That's pretty good, actually. And accompanied him in all his journeys, and in his absence could not be better pleased than by hearing of his praises. In short, nothing could have made this matrimonial connection more happy, but its being more fruitful. They never had a heir. The general built a comfortable house, a single story with one sitting room, but many chambers. Its materials were made of the most durable kind of cypress, but it received no coat either of paint or varnish. Here his friends were received with a hearty welcome and good cheer, and the stranger with kind hospitality. His planting interests were judicially managed, and his property increased yearly. In the summer months, he made excursions into the upper country almost every year for the benefit of his health. In these journeys, he loved to renew former recollections. He had retained his marquee, camp bed, and cooking utensils, and he always traveled as he had done in his brigade. To his wife, nothing could be more pleasing. And she often recounted these joints to her friends with delight. The old pot, the kettle, and frying pan, tin plates, knives, and forks were preserved as precious relics. Sumpter mules made as friends, and his faithful servant Oscar, who had accompanied him in all his difficulties, always received the highest marks of his favor. She was a remarkable lady. She liked to go camping with the general. And even today, a lot of ladies don't like to go camping. But back in those days, ladies didn't leave the parlor. So here she was going out in the woods, and she could laugh. I don't know how many of you go camping, but you can't go camping very often that the tent doesn't leak or something happens that makes you miserable, and you go home and you laugh about it. And she could laugh about it, and quite frankly, he could too. And that shows a certain temperament that is kind of nice. This was the first marriage for both of them. He was 52, she was 47. They undoubtedly had trouble. Again, I would say, I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, that would be fair. But I would be hard put to say that if you have been married for any length of time, you have not had an argument with your spouse. Anyone who says otherwise is crossing their fingers. The point is that in the long run, they got along well, and it was a happy marriage. That they were related is not remarkable. When their parents were married, that's 1700, there were only about 5,000 white settlers in all of South Carolina. By the time Marion and Mary Esther were born, there was only about 10,000 white settlers in all of South Carolina. And some of these were little kids, and some were women, some were men. And so the gene pool was very small. Now, the general's nephews and nieces, after his death, and people want to write biographies, they didn't seem to know how he and Mary Esther were related. But they did know that the general called her cousin, and she called him cousin. Little pet names, okay? Cousin Frank. Why was it Cousin Frank? Well, as you're going to see, she had a brother Frank, she had a nephew Frank, and she had an uncle Frank. So it makes sense that, and we have evidence that they actually were called Frank. So it makes sense that she called him Cousin Frank, because that was the relationship. They say the two of them even looked a little alike. Okay. Well, we know Francis Marion was born in St. John's Parish in 1732. His mother was Esther Cords, who was the daughter of Dr. Anthony Cords. And she is buried in St. John's Parish Church, which is a pagan church, which is just a shell now. It burned in 1755 by accident, in 1781 by intent. And so the records of that church, as far as we know, don't exist. Mary Esther was born in St. Thomas Parish, September 17, 1737, and all those records do exist. So we know that her mother was Anne Cords Simmons Rideau, and her father was Henry Rideau. All right, Anne had been married twice. The first time she married Frank Simmons, and the second, she had 4 children by him. The second time she married Henry Rideau, and she had 4 children by him. She had 8 children in 19 years. She was a very busy lady. She was the baby sister of Esther Marion, the general's mother. So they were first cousins. General Marion and Mary Esther were first cousins. Now that seems a little strange to us today, but back then it was common. Again, keep in mind the gene pool was small, people had large families, and so people did that. A little background about South Carolina to help you understand why that was so common. South Carolina was a very unhealthy place to live. 57% of the white children born did not live to be 5 years old. And as you do genealogy, you see some families where they would have one child after another, and none of them lived. Tough, tough life. Few white people lived beyond the age of 60. And I put it that way because a lot of black folks lived into their 90s, believe it or not. So it was tough for white folks. They just could not take the climate. There was no such thing as respectable employment for a woman. The only time a woman could have respectable employment is if she had a husband that had some sort of a business that he was running, and the husband died and she continued to run it. But other than that, a woman's employment was to be a housewife. A man only had respectable employment. And I say that because if you were a laborer or if you were an artisan, that was not considered, that was low brow, that was down there. That wasn't respectable. The only thing you could do is own a plantation, be a doctor, lawyer, minister, or be in foreign trade, sea captain, an international merchant, or something like that. That puts you into the better class of people. The only way a woman would own property is if she inherited it or was gifted to her. Now, on marriage, everything she owned, right down to her socks, belonged to her husband. And he could do with that property whatever he wanted to do with it. He could leave her I wouldn't say naked, that probably wouldn't be socially acceptable.
Just with socks.
Just with socks, yeah. No, with a shift, okay. Out on the street, that was all right. Not that people would approve of it, it would be legal. By law, when the husband died, the wife was entitled to 1/3 of the personal property. Now, you see a lot of wills back then that say, I give to my wife 1/3 of my personal property and the right to use my remaining property for life. Well, and on remarriage, or for life or remarriage, or if she remarried, she would lose the use of the property. That was very important. It seems cruel to us today, but that was very important because if they didn't do that, the children by the first marriage would be impoverished on the second marriage because, again, that second husband would get everything the wife owned. Careful parents would sometimes put, if they wanted to provide for a female relative, they would put the property in trust and make some male member of the family the trustee. Now, a good parent would set up their boys with businesses or plantations so they could have a respectable income, and they would give their daughters a dowry of sorts to make them attractive to the young men, and together they would, the dowry and the set of the dad would give them the plantation and the workers and the equipment they needed to be successful planters. Land was cheap. It was the workers and the equipment that was expensive. So, happy life, happy married life meant you had to have money, both on the male and the female side. Without that, there were problems. So let's look at Anne's family, and let's look at Mary Esther's family, and that is her mother, Anne. And you don't have to take notes. I'm not going to test you on this. Okay? I'll sleep.
What? No test?
Huh?
No test?
No test. No test. Okay. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I really want you to kind of get the drift of how this thing goes. Okay. Anne was born. That's Mary Esther's mother. Was born in 1703. She was married at the age of 21 in 1724. She died in 1772 at the age of 69. She beat the odds. Right? Frank Simmons was her husband, and by Frank Simmons she had Anne, born 1725, married 1743, dies 1744 at the age of 19. She has Frank Jr., born 1726, married 1750, dies 1771 at the age of 45. Hannah, born 1728, married 1749, dies 1765 at the age of 37. She has Esther. Now this is important with Esther. She's born 1730, marries 1752, dies 1773 at the age of 43. Now Esther marries Josiah Alston, whose brother is John Alston, who marries Esther Marion, the general's sister. Close family here. Frank Simmons, as I said, dies in 1731. All of his children get married after his death, which means husband number 2 takes care of him. All right? Because when Anne remarried, remember, all her property now belongs to husband number 2. Anne's husband, Frank Simmons' will provided his executor was Gabriel Marion, the general's father. And one of the witnesses to the will was Henry Vidal, who would eventually marry Anne in 1733. They were all neighbors. So they were close. All right. So now we come to Henry. Anne marries Henry in 1733. His first daughter is Anne in 1733. She dies, she just kind of disappears off the face of the earth. I'm assuming she died very young. Mary Esther, 1737. A son, Peter, 1743. He dies during the war in 1781. And Henry Jr., 1744 born, he dies 1773 at the age of 29. All right. Henry, when he dies, has no will. So his wife, Anne, inherits 1/3 of his estate, and everything else goes to Peter, who is the oldest boy. Now, chances are General Marion and Mary Esther knew each other from childhood. These were old friends. She was not a stranger. So then the question becomes, if they were old friends and the families had actually been intermarrying, why was Frances Marion and Mary Esther not married earlier? By 1755, she was 18. This is a good age to get married in those days. So what's going on? Well, we're told, by Harry Lee again, that the general's father provided for his older children, but when it came to the two youngest boys, Joe and Francis, Gabriel Marion had become a little embarrassed in his affairs and was unable to provide for his two youngest sons. Now, in the best I could determine, that probably happened around 1740. He started having financial problems. And that may have been why Frances Marion went to sea. If Dad couldn't set him up in a plantation, as he did the older boys, then a life at sea allowed a clever man to become ship's captain, and that was the key to fortune and respectability. But those of you who know Frances Marion's story know that literally the ship sunk from under Frances Marion. He was in a small boat for a number of days, ate the ship's dog, and never wanted to go back to sea again. You can kind of understand why. All right. We come to 1755. Frances Marion has nothing financially. He's living with his brother and his mother in Georgetown. He has no prospects. He's not going to inherit anything from anybody. He has no money of his own. And at this time, his brother and mother and Francis all move west. They move out of Georgetown. They move out to the area of Frierson's Lock. I have no idea where that was, but I assume it's out near Utah Springs, out that way. It's not clear, as I say, Frances is penniless, and Mary Esther is penniless, basically. She's still in her mother's household. And it's not clear that Anne Cords, her mother, had any wherewithal to provide for her daughter, to give her a dowry. If Frances and Mary Esther had been married at that time, they would have been penniless, living in a shack someplace, and that was not a good thing. The other thing is that I'm assuming that even had Anne had the wherewithal, that Frances Marion was probably not looked at as a good prospect as a husband. We're told he was small, he had been sickly. Given the mortality rate, people probably figured he's going to die young. You know, get a big guy that's robust that he can take care of you. All right, but Marion, they move out to the western part of the state, and in 1757, Marion's mother dies, and she leaves him half of a trust fund that had been made up for her by her brother, and that's about 1,700 pounds, which is a respectable amount of money, but not really enough to set up housekeeping. And three servants that had been family servants. His former nurse, Willoughby, who could not have been very young, a boy, June, and a boy, Peter. June is the father of Buddy, by the way. And so Marion goes west with his brother, Gabriel, and Gabriel allows Marion, Frances Marion, to farm on his property. Well, in essence, Frances Marion at this point is a sharecropper on his brother's property. Not a very prestigious situation to be in. People who knew him at the time said his finances were pretty thin, was the way it was described. But Marion's hardworking, he's saving, he starts buying small pieces of property here and there. And of course, this is all undeveloped property. It has to be developed before it can be farmed. And he's accumulating the material he needs to have a successful farming or plantation operation. The Cherokee War comes along, he covers himself with glory. He's picked, specially handpicked by the British to be trained as a light infantry officer. This is like saying we picked you to be an airborne ranger commander. This is heavy stuff. He goes out in the woods, he shows he's tough as nails, he's nobody's pushover. He's a scrawny guy, but boy is he tough. And he's fearless, and he comes home, and all the men in the community now respect Frances Marion, captain in the Cherokee War. So So he's no longer Gabriel's little brother, which is a good thing from his point of view. He continues to try to accumulate property. In 1773, this is a kind of a, well, go back a little bit, 1772. In 1772, Anne Vidot dies. And with her death, she leaves she has 1/3 of the estate of Henry Vidot. She leaves in equal shares to her 3 children. So now Mary Esther has a little bit of money of her own. She has 1/6 of her father's estate. Then Brother Henry dies in 1773. And Henry leaves Mary Esther a riding horse named Nolt. And by that we know Mary Esther was not the type of lady that had to ride in a carriage. She liked to ride on a horse. Okay? And Brother Henry leaves her 500 pounds, respectable, and he leaves her 100 head of cattle. Now, she has a little bit of property, but with the cattle she has a means of making a living off the cattle. Same year, Frances Marion buys Pond Bluff. This is now a settlement that is suitable to bring a wife to. It's a nice house, big house, established, he didn't have to build it. He does it with a loan from his brother Gabriel of 500 pounds and his own money. Now, things are looking up for Frances Marion, and they're also looking up for Mary Esther, because we're told by Captain Parker, who's a friend of the two of them, that Frances Marion and Esther had been correspondents for years. Now, that was a term he used, correspondence. How far that went, I don't know. But I will say it meant they hung out together. And they like to go places and do things together. And I'll leave it at that. You come to your own conclusions. We do know that during the war years, he trusted her 100%, because same Captain Parker said all during the war, General Marion always communicated with Mary Esther. She always knew where he was. She always knew what he was doing. And she would communicate that to other people in the community who were friends of the revolution. So in fact, she was part of the spy network, all right? And that's some of the things she was doing. 100% trust between Frances Marion and Mary Esther. Known each other from childhood. So you figure out what correspondence means. All right. Things are looking up. We have Mary Esther with some money, some means of earning a living. We have Frances buying a nice house, but the world's falling apart. The revolution is beginning. Lost the Tea Party, the Colorado Acts. Things are just spinning downhill towards revolution, and probably did not seem like an apt time to get married, to begin a family. All right, we go through the war. We get to the end of the war. Frances Marion began the war with 1 sister and 4 brothers. By the war's end, they were all dead. Marion had been named the guardian of Job's children, his brother Job's children, and his brother Gabriel's children. During the war, his brother Gabriel had a son Gabriel, and the son Gabriel had been a lieutenant in the Continental Army and served with Frances Marion. The nephew Gabriel was captured by the British, actually by loyalists, and as soon as his name was pronounced, he was murdered on the spot. About that time, and I can't get the exact time, but my feeling is it was as a result of this murder of Gabriel. The general goes out and he grabs his 2 nephews that are approaching military age, Robert Marion, son of Gabriel, and Samuel Theodore Marion, son of Job, and he somehow, although the British are all over everywhere, he somehow manages to get these 2 young men to Philadelphia with a load of wood to pay for them to be admitted to the University of Pennsylvania, which is where these 2 young men spend the war years. Now, this is not because the general wants to protect his family, because his nephews by his sister that are carrying the Mitchell name all fight with him. They're out in the field fighting. As was Peter Vidot, his first cousin, is out there in the field fighting with him. So he wasn't particularly just protecting his family. It was these 2 young men who basically had a death warrant because of their last name, and he got them out of town. Now, Peter Vidot, He was the guy that inherited all his father's money. He's serving with General Marion, and he is killed in 1781, late 80. And the family says he died in General Marion's arms, and his last words to the general was, "Take care of Mary Esther." So the war ends for Mary Esther. All of her family is dead. Her mother, her father, her brothers, all of her half-brothers and sisters are also dead. She is alone, but she now is very wealthy because of Peter's death. So we have two people who've been friends for life, both alone, both hardworking. Francis is just about ruined financially. He has some money that's going to come in from his brother's estates when they're finally settled, but they're just so unsettled in the Carolinas that all of a sudden major pieces of property that have been worth a lot of money are worth almost nothing because so much loyalist property is being dumped on the market. It depresses the value of everything. And so, for example, his brother Benjamin, who'd been very wealthy, his estate can't move his property. You keep seeing repeated ads in the newspaper and important property coming up for sale, and it doesn't sell. So, at this juncture, Robert and Samuel come home from college. And Samuel falls in love with Robert's sister, Charlotte. And so they plan to be married. Now you can picture this. We have this family gathering with the nephews and nieces and the widows of the brothers, and they're all planning this marriage, and they're all talking family. And the matriarch of the family and the senior guy of the family are alone. And yet they've had this lifetime connection with each other. So there must have been a little bit of a plot going on there. And apparently at one of these wedding planning get-togethers of the family, Mary Esther, they get talking about poor General Marion out there by himself. And Mary Esther apparently makes a comment like, "Well, I'd marry him if he'd only asked me." And that gets back rather rapidly to the general, who is a little on the shy side, didn't get nothing to offer. And he goes and he pops the question, and she agrees. So there's a double wedding. Samuel and Charlotte are married at Walnut Grove Plantation, which was next to Pond Bluff. All the guests get in their carriages and they drive over to Pond Bluff, and the general and Mary Esther are married. And by all accounts, although there were some ups and downs in the marriage, it was basically a happy marriage. He dies in 1795. They say she was inconsolable. This hit her really hard. She lives another 20 years. She dies in 1815. And during that period, she never remarried. When she married the general, she never tried to keep any of her property back from him. She trusted him with all of her property. She wanted all of the kids, all the grandkids, well, they weren't grandkids, they were grandnephews and nieces. She wanted everyone to call her grandma. She took her role very seriously as being the matriarch of the family. She kept tabs of everybody. There is one letter that we found from Mary Esther, and it was written to Julia Ward Howe, who was a great niece. She's the same lady that wrote Battle of the Republic. She was living in Massachusetts at the time. And there'd been this correspondence between them. And it's a very tender letter because they're talking about all the different members of the family and how they're doing and how are the servants doing, and there were presents back and forth, and the servants say hi to Mary, and it's just a very warm letter. She signed it Mary, E initial. Her handwriting looks a little like his, but clearly a very warm lady. And so when she finally passed, I will read what's noted on her tombstone. She died in July 1815 at the age of 75. She beat the odds too when it came to life expectancy. Among the many virtues of this amiable lady were those of piety, charity, affection, benevolence, and humanity, particularly to her domestics. She died lamented as she had lived esteemed by all those who knew her. And that is Mrs. General Frances Marion. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. Do we have any portraits?
No, not that I know of. If you go online, you can see all sorts of strange things, but none of them, as far as I know, are correct. Online, it says that she escaped from prison and met the general after the war, and they got married and they had 2 kids. No, didn't happen.
Where did she die?
She was at, is it Pineville, was it? Yeah. And then she's buried with him at Belle
Because
Isle.
in the city directory of Charleston, there's some Francis Marion notations, which I wondered, where that was or who that was.
Well, you know, when she
Like in
got,
1815, something like that.
when she died, it was in all the newspapers.
Okay.
So she was a significant enough person that the obituary was carried in all the major papers. And then there was a battle over his will, and that got in some of the papers. Yes.
Okay, you mentioned that there was matrimonial bliss.
I said it was good for the most part.
Okay, and you may or may not have heard the story, and I forget where I read it, but so when Marion would go out, and he would go out checking his fields, then we'd come back home, and he'd ride past an open window and throw his hat in. And if his hat came back out, he kept riding.
So there's been a number of stories. I personally think that Francis Marion had a strange sense of humor. He named his horse a gelding ball, all right? And this was amongst a bunch of farmers who would have enjoyed the triple entendre, Colonel Ball, horse ball, whatever. But his funny thing is, in his will, he calls the horse Independence. He doesn't use it. He cleans up the act of it. There's a story about Henry Mouzon showing up at the house. Now, half their friends thought this was going to be a marriage made in heaven, and the other half were taking bets on who's going to kill who first. Very assertive people. She was a sharp business lady. There's accounts you can see in the court records of her suing people for money she's loaned. There's an account of Henry Mouzon showing up at the house. The general's walking around outside pacing. He doesn't have a hat on. Mouzon says, General, you should have a hat on. It's very hot. And he says, there's a damn sight hotter in there. So I think that the story that you're relating is a tall tale. Because I don't think that Mary Esther ever swept the floor herself. She had servants that would do that. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised that if Mouzon got the story around about the general pacing outside his house, that Marion got razzed by his friends about that. And he said, I don't have to worry about her. I just put my hat with, if that's up, then I don't go in. That's how I handled that problem. But I don't think that particular story was correct. They do say that she had a temper like a bolt of thunder and lightning, that it was sharp and it was quick, but then it went away. And again, any lady who would go camping with her husband and be happy about it can't be all that. Yes?
Is there any evidence that she was ever in harm's way during the time 1780, 1782 when Marion is fighting all these battles, and they're apparently corresponding with one another? You would think that if the loyalists of British could capture her, that might hurt him, you know what I mean?
You would, but I think that she was a maiden lady. She had no visible part in the war. And everybody back there was related to everybody else. Job's wife, that sounds like, Job's wife, her maiden name was Gilliard, and her brothers were all officers in the Loyalist militia. So I don't think anybody bothered her, to tell you the truth. And I don't think he put anything in writing, and I don't think he was that stupid. And I don't think she put anything in writing. I think it was a question of they had servants that were very loyal, and they would communicate that way. Yes?
Did he have any children?
No, neither of them had any children of their own.
One, I knew she did.
No,
They did.
no, neither of them had any children of their own. He adopted Isaac, his brother's grandson, Dwight, because Mr. Dwight and Isaac's daughter, I forget her name, who married Mr. Dwight, both died. And so they had 2 children without a parent, and Marion took them in. They also adopted another grandniece whose parents were both gone. So they formally brought in a girl and a boy that they took care of, and then they had all these other kids that were not by 21 that they were looking after, that they took care of. The child that is a mystery to me is Job St. Julian. He would have been not quite, well, he wasn't an adult yet, but he certainly was military age. He simply disappears from the face of the earth between 1779 and 1783 or 84. Whether he left the state, he changed his name, I could find no record of it anywhere, which was strange, but he did not go to Philadelphia and go into the University of Philadelphia. He may have gone there, but not enrolled in the university. Yeah, oh, somebody over here? Keith, yes.
Karen, I was just going to add, you mentioned something about Fryerson's. Frierson was actually a plantation that was just now underwater. It was out in the middle, kind of in the northern part of Lake Moultrie now, but it was virtually south of where Belle Isle is today. And so it was, and they lived there for only a year, and then he came back and lived on part of what became, it was called Burnside Valley, on part of Gabriel married his brother's property, Belle Isle. It was called Burnside Valley.
Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
Fryerson's was a name of a plantation, and was located just south of where Belle Isle is. It's currently underwater. And Gabriel and Francis lived there for about a year. When Gabriel got married, his wife's parents gave him Belle Isle as a wedding gift. I think that was the number of what you were saying. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just thinking about the Francis first will with, and this is just recollection, but it seemed like I remember something that in that will that he gave a corpse or something. He gave something to a natural.
Okay. So Gabriel had what they called at the time a natural child. All right. We would say an illegitimate child today. The mother of that child was Gabriel's cousin, Marion. And I don't know whether that child came into existence before or after his marriage to Charlotte Taylor, I think was Gabriel's wife. In any event, General Marion was that child's godparent. And both he and Gabriel Marion Jr., the kid that got killed, left William, initially in General's first will, left William some property. In his second will, he doesn't. William by that time is an adult. And the interesting thing is, in the General's second will, he makes Robert Marion executive first, and William Marion executive second, which is strange that he didn't include Samuel Theodore, and I think there was some rocky road there between those two. Yeah.
One of the things about the family, I found some record in the Carolina, and I believe it was either with either Job or Gabriel, but that was set in Eleuthera Island, maybe in I can't remember the year, but like 1760s, maybe before that, which kind of indicated to me. It was written on actually it was a written book that one of those two brothers had written on, but it was set in Eleuthera Island, which indicated to me that if that was anything, a trail was that one of the Marion had been on a ship to Eleuthera, because I can't remember what it is, in the Caribbean somewhere.
Well, here's the problem, is that Marion's father Gabriel had brothers, and they had families, and they had male descendants. So just because you see a male with the name of Marion doesn't mean it's in Francis Marion's brothers and in his line. In fact, most of the people that carry the name Marion today come from those uncles that were the father's brothers. All right, the only brother of Francis Marion that had male descendants was Joe. Everybody else had all ladies. So, I'm not sure I understood your question, but hopefully that answered it. And if it doesn't, tough luck.
Did I hear you correctly saying that there was regular correspondence between Francis Marion and Mary Elster
That's correct.
during the Revolutionary War?
Yes.
So initially I thought you wanted to share more.
Well, here's the thing, the word correspondence has different meanings. It can mean I write you a letter, but it can also mean keeping company. So when Captain Parker said they were correspondents for years, I kind of think he meant both. And during the war, I don't think, as I said earlier, I don't think the general ever put anything in writing to Mary Esther. It would be too dangerous. They probably communicated using an intermediary who would run messages back and forth. That would be my thought on that. Thank you very much.